Well, we are thrilled to have this crowd here today. This is proof you put a Holden on the program and you're going to get a good crowd. We're great to thrilled to have all of you here, though. We've looked forward to this program when we heard that Chuck Holden was spending this summer here in Greene County and in Ames, and might be available, if we could twist his arm, to come talk to us about being a professional historian, a professor, an author of 3 books on history. He's really at the high point of a career right now he's worked hard to get there. He graduated. He's the son of Ed and Mary Ann Holden. I want to introduce the other Holdens here today. Brother Mike is right here. Mike, raise your hand. Sister Rosemary Hoyt, right there. Sister Mary Jo Kleesner from Ames. There we go, Mary Jo, thank you. And Ann Kendall from Des Moines. Great to have you all here. Thank you. I got a chance to talk to Chuck a couple times last fall. One time, was it, or a year ago?
2019.
Yeah, 2019. We got together, and then again recently a couple times, and chatted on the phone. Very interesting career that he has had. Starting from Scranton High School, 1980 grad, and with a number 24 kids in the class, I think, something like that. 1980 grad, went to Iowa U for a year, then finished his college undergrad years at St. John's University up in Minnesota. Came back to Creighton for his master's degree, then on to Penn State University for his doctorate. Taught at UNC Greensboro. Were you finishing your doctorate then?
Yeah.
And then for 22 years now at St. Mary's College of Maryland in St. Mary's City, Maryland, which is a historic place in itself, as he'll tell you about that. But I wanted to just set the stage for his credentials. He's already done some interesting projects with his books. We'll hear some about that, and he's got another one that he's starting to work on now, or at least exploring, that I'm excited about especially. And so we're going to have him speak for a while, and then we'll have some questions from the audience, and I reserve the first one. So join me in a home Greene County welcome for one of our bright native sons, Professor Chuck Holden.
I don't know who that guy was that introduced, but he sounds good. Looking forward to hearing this myself. Just to get into the growing up in Greene County frame of mind, I had a Mountain Dew on the way over. I probably shaved 5 minutes off of the top right there. If suddenly 3 cans of Mountain Dew appear, I'll take that as a signal to hurry up. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chuck. David, it's wonderful to be here. It's always good to be home. It may come as a surprise to learn that when I was a boy growing up on our farm south of Scranton, hearing the trains passing through a mile away, listening to a ball game on my radio, listening to the music on an AM station from some exotic sounding faraway city like Fort Wayne, it may come as a surprise to learn that falling asleep, my last thought of the day was not, when I grow up, I want to be an historian. Looking back, however, I see that there were important Greene County influences that at least opened up the possibilities of living the life of an academic. In high school, for example, thanks to Bev Lehman, my English teacher from the 6th grade until I went off to college. Poor Bev. I thought it might be pretty cool to be a writer. Still, that seemed impossible. Who writes books? But given what I've ended up doing for a career, I was lucky in that both my parents were college educated, so we had books around the house. Mom and Dad had both spent years away from Scranton and Jefferson, so the idea of leaving Greene County for college, maybe one day for good, was not unthinkable. The family influence was also there in that Mom and Dad and our aunts and uncles often talked to us about the family history. So the story of Grandpa Bruner, Mike Bruner, a Catholic, disrupting the local Ku Klux Klan rally to make an ice cream delivery was part of that history. But so was the odd coincidence that old Highway 30 ran west on the south side of Scranton and then mysteriously turned north into the town and right past my great-grandfather J.W. Holden's house. J.W. Holden, who happened to sit on the Iowa State Highway Commission at the time. What are the odds? That was also part of the family lore. Especially during the summer, Mom took us to the Scranton Library. I loved the library. Still love libraries. And the musty smell of old books. This too opened up a big world for me. Like other boys, I was interested in the books on World War II. Still, a career as an historian, I'm pretty sure I did not even know there was such a thing. I was not a history major in college. I took exactly one history course in college, and that was during my freshman year at the University of Iowa. A story in and of itself that I'll share with you sometime, before I transferred to St. John's. So I took no history classes at St. John's. It was after St. John's, when I moved to St. Paul, that my interest in history took off. Two factors were involved. One was where we lived. My Johnny friends and I rented a house on the edge of a predominantly African-American neighborhood. The difference between their lives and ours was striking. With our college degrees already in hand, our path to some kind of middle-class life was largely assumed, not for our neighbors. And that got me thinking, how did this happen? And that got me interested in history. Second, our neighborhood also had a number of used bookstores. I have to explain to my students now that once upon a time there were these magical places called used bookstores. Hopping off the bus, coming home from work, I'd stop and I'd browse. And before long, I had a nice bookshelf full of biographies of Bobby Kennedy, JFK, Lincoln. Stephen Oates' book on Martin Luther King was an introduction to the history of race relations and African American history generally. David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest, a book on Vietnam. William Manchester's The Glory and the Dream, a book on the years 1932 to 72. Just blew me away. History books could read like this. Then one of the biggest moments of my life came in a conversation with my parents over breakfast at Lake Okoboji in the summer of 1987. We were doing the usual, so how's work, talk, as I worked for the Higher Education Assistance Foundation at that time. That sounds very impressive, doesn't it? Student loans. I said, it's going okay. Thought I might be promoted, but I wasn't really sure I wanted to stick with the job. It was fine, it just wasn't very challenging. Mom and Dad asked, since I had a business degree, what about getting an MBA? No chance. Wasn't interested. Now, for those of you in back, I said MBA, not NBA. I realize, given the stature, that could be confusing. No, they were not suggesting that I get in the MBA. What about law school? Didn't know what kind of law I might want to practice. My dad then asked me point blank, if you could go back and study anything right now, what would it be? And with no thought, I blurted out, history, I guess. This surprised Dad, but then Mom, and those of you who remember Mom, quietly reminded us both that she had a history degree from Creighton. Yeah. They then pointed out that I was single, no kids, no mortgage, not even much student loan debt at that time. If not now, when? I was 25 at the time. By that next fall, I had quit my job. I was at Creighton, starting my master's in way over my head. Again, I was not a history major. but I was completely obsessed with it. I remember very clearly one night during my first semester, after our weekly graduate seminar in 20th century U.S. history, driving back to my apartment in Council Bluffs. Couldn't live in Nebraska. Couldn't do it. This is maybe a 5-minute drive from Creighton to where I lived, with exactly one exit. Take the bridge over the Missouri River, take the exit, you're home. Couldn't be simpler. Well, that night I managed to miss that one exit because I was completely lost in thought about what we had been discussing in our seminar that night. And it dawned on me that I had never been so consumed by anything the way that I was with studying history. This was my, I think I have a calling moment. Then, as Chuck said, from Creighton to Penn State for my PhD, I began teaching at Penn State and then at UNC Greensboro while finishing up my degree. Graduated from Penn State in 1997, hired by St. Mary's College in 1999, or as I tell my students, in a previous century, which just, oh my God, how did that happen? So, all right, so it's a Sunday afternoon and here you are, and I am going to tell you what historians actually do. So this is your last chance, right? If you want to beat it, I understand. No. Graduate school in history trains you how to find and analyze primary sources. Primary sources are documents of that time, whatever time you're studying. We distinguish them from secondary sources. A biography about Lincoln is a secondary source. A letter Lincoln wrote to General Grant, that's a primary source. As would be a diary, a piece of legislation, a memo, a business contract, a will, an advertisement, song lyrics. So secondary sources, again, like a biography, use primary sources to tell their story. Primary sources are our bread and butter. So graduate school helps you figure out where all the different kinds of primary sources may be located. Again, things like government records, newspapers, business records, church records, baptisms, funerals, church committee minutes, boxes of grandpa's stuff from the war in the attic, the letters and the diaries that might be in with grandpa's stuff from the war in the attic. Speaking of which, if you have some of grandpa's stuff from the war in the attic, please see me after this talk. And now increasingly databases have become hugely important as they offer access to primary sources as well. You also do an immense amount of reading in graduate school. Some of this reading is just straight up content. If you go to graduate school wanting to study Lincoln, then you're going to get assigned a ton of books to learn as much as you possibly can about Lincoln. But in doing that, you're also learning about what other historians of your specialty have already written about Lincoln. You're learning about what other historians, or how other historians have interpreted the primary sources that they used. And by interpretation, I really just mean what conclusions did they draw by looking at those primary sources. So, you read the other historians of today, but you also steep yourself in the work of historians from the past. In other words, you're learning the history of the history. Oh, right? This is what we call historiography. In order to really have a command of a subject, you have to know what's been written about your subject by other historians. So the workload is intense. A full load in graduate school is 3 courses per semester, and it was not uncommon to have 800 to 1,000 pages of reading assigned in a week. That's the coursework part of graduate school. It takes 2 to 3 years. We then take both written and oral comps at the end of all that, at least we did at Penn State. Next, our goal as graduate students is to find some space, either on the content side or on the historiographical side, that has not been examined or that has not been, as we would say, done to death. Oh, that's been done to death, right? We want our dissertation to fill that space, and by doing so, offer a new perspective or offer new content. Look what I found. Or some combination of both. So, my dissertation then looked at what I call the Southern conservative intellectual tradition from before the Civil War to the early 20th century. Here's the thumbnail story. Before the war, before the Civil War, Southern conservatives based their entire worldview, their politics, their understanding of family, of community, their understanding of Christianity, on their belief that slavery was not only okay, but it was divinely sanctioned. Obviously, the enslaved people disagreed, as did the abolitionists and eventually people like Lincoln. My question, though, was how is it that conservative Southerners continued to refer to themselves as conservatives once they no longer owned slaves? If defending slavery was at the heart of Southern conservatism, which it was, what happens when there's no slavery? So in studying for my comps, I realized that no one had really looked at this transition, right? This transition to a post-slavery conservative worldview. Even though we knew that these Southerners continued to refer to themselves as conservatives. Good. That's the space, right? My dissertation committee, other professors then said, that sounds good, go do that. So I chose South Carolina as my focal point, and then I studied the personal and public writings of 4 men who self-identified as conservative and whose years connect the Thomas Jefferson years of the early 1800s with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan in 1945. And there's a period of time where they actually overlapped, where the two of them actually knew each other pretty well. So I thought, that's great. That gives me that transition. Now, here's the how-to part of being a historian. I tracked down any references to these men in newspapers I could find. I tracked down any speeches they may have given. 3 out of the 4 held public office. One had been a college professor in the 1840s and 1850s. I was able to track down his lecture notes. Thank you. You're right. Thank you. That was a good find. Yes, I was very proud of that. 2 of them had written books, but they were long out of circulation. They were not easy to find. And for all 4, I was able to track down their personal papers, family letters, correspondence with friends and colleagues. One kept a diary that lasted for over 30 years. These were located in various archives in Charleston and Columbia, South Carolina, Durham and Chapel Hill, North Carolina, the Library of Congress in D.C. So out of all of these documents, and altogether there would have been several thousand, the diary alone went on for 4,000 pages. I was able to piece together the bigger picture of what I was seeing through those years, through 3 generations of men who self-identified as conservatives. And what I concluded was that their basis for conservatism had to adjust, of course, no slaves, but they were very skillful in making sure that it did not adjust all that much. What remained consistent through all those years, pre-war and post-war, was the conservative belief in white supremacy, male supremacy, and that democracy itself was bad and dangerous. In short, what remained consistent was the conservative belief in hierarchies, plural. Once I defended the dissertation, and I can tell you how the defense dissertation works later, I sent the manuscript to the University of South Carolina Press, and happily for me, they offered a book contract. So the dissertation then, with considerable revisions, then became the first book with the very serious sounding title of In the Great Maelstrom, Conservatives in Post-Civil War South Carolina. I'm just shocked that wasn't made into a movie. Leaps off the page. In the Great Maelstrom. Among my friends, the nickname for the book is just Maelstrom, which I like actually. Just, oh yeah, Maelstrom, yeah, that's me. Yeah. So the origin story of that book is a pretty traditional one. The dissertation turned into the first book. So let me touch briefly on the origins of the Agnew book next. And you'll see how, despite the training, some book ideas come from seemingly random sets of circumstances. The Agnew book started when Zach Massetti came to St. Mary's College in 2002 to run our Center for the Study of Democracy. I was on the center's advisory board, so we got to know each other right away. We became fast friends as well. Zach's a great guy. We're still really good buddies. And so we also started looking for a topic to work together on. We should do something together. One day, stopping by his office to see if he wanted to go for coffee, Zach looked up from his desk, saw me, and said, "Spiro Agnew." And I said, "Yes!" I knew exactly what he was talking about. Agnew was a Marylander. We're in Maryland. Former vice president under Richard Nixon. He had to resign in 1973 to avoid jail time for tax evasion. We could see very quickly that there had been practically no books or articles written on Agnew. Yet, again, one of the benefits of experience kicked in. We both had a good hunch that there was, as we would say, there's something there. Right? There's something there. We then had the great fortune of being able to talk with Ben Bradley, the legendary editor of the Washington Post from the Watergate days. Ben was a trustee at St. Mary's College in Maryland. You're trying to, that name, he's played by Tom Hanks. And Tom Hanks nailed it, by the way, right? Mr. Bradley then introduced us to Richard Cohen, a journalist who was on the Agnew beat for the Washington Post at that time. So one evening, Zach and I, with Bradley and Cohen, right? Zach and I sat as they reminisced about the Watergate, Nixon, and Agnew days. Zach and I were just soaking this up, as you can imagine. But we came away from that more convinced than ever that this was a story we wanted to tell. We were both finishing other books at the time. Zach then left St. Mary's for Oklahoma. He was then named president of Ripon College in Wisconsin, where he still is. So it wasn't really until 2012, 2013 that we really dug into the Agnew project in earnest. Now, the story of the Agnew book is also a good, if typical, example of how long it takes to get books published in academic circles. We had a good working draft of the whole book done in late 2015. The book came out in late 2019. Here are the steps of the publication process. And again, here's your chance, right? Here's how it goes. If a press is interested, you send a manuscript with an idea to the press. In this case, the University of Virginia Press. If they're interested, they send, once the manuscript is complete, they send it out to what are called readers. They send it out to 3 readers. Readers are experts in the field. In this case, Spiro Agnew, we need an expert in someone who does political history, say after World War II, right? The readers then read over the entire manuscript and they write up a report for the press. These are reader reports. The reader reports will assess the strength of the argument, whether the appropriate primary sources were used, the clarity of the writing, and ultimately, they recommend publication or not. This takes 6 to 9 months to get those reader reports back to the press and back to the author. The author then gets a chance to respond. So the author writes up a response to the reader reports. They get back sent through the press to the reader. So the author's response might say something like, the reader makes a good point that the argument in chapter 3 could be made more clear, right? Or sometimes an author might respond with, I am genuinely hard-pressed to understand how the reader arrived at this particular criticism of chapter 3. Meaning, this reader's a fool, and I'm not changing it unless the editor says I have to. Then the reader gets the chance to respond to the response to the original reader report. This may take another few months. And remember, there are 3 readers, right? Once everyone is satisfied with the revisions, the manuscript then goes to copy edits. So copy editors are people who will read over the entire manuscript, and they're looking for every little writing error. Should that comma in the footnote go inside the quotation marks or outside the quotation marks? They will also work to smooth out any rough spots in the prose itself, tighten up sentences. The author then has to sign off on the copy edit. Say, yes, these look fine, or no, I'm not going to make that change. So the copy edit stage also takes 3 to 4 months to complete. Once the response to the copy edits are done, the manuscript editor, this is the person who's overseeing this whole process, right? They have to say yay or nay, are we in or not, right? And if they say yay, then we go to what are called page proofs. This too takes a matter of months. Page proofs are where the manuscript is put into the format, the font, page numbers, images, table of contents, of how the book will look once it's published. The page proofs are the last chance you have to catch any typo, any comma in the wrong place. Double check all of your dates. Double check all the spelling of the names that you're using. The publisher limits what an author can change in the page proofs, however. In other words, if I said at the page proof stage, ooh, you know, I really think I need to edit a paragraph to chapter 5, they would say, too late. Because at that stage, it would cost the press more money to make those changes, and they don't want to spend it. So, reading over the page proofs is nerve-wracking. Because again, this is it. Once you're done, it's the last time you'll see it before it comes out as a book. And then several months after all of that, a box shows up with the first copies of the finished book. And that's a really cool moment when you open that box and you pick it up and you think, oh my God, there it is. It's a long, slow, agonizing process. When I first started getting op-eds published, I was amazed, and you newspaper men in the house know this, I was amazed at how fast the publication process moved in the newspaper world. Zach and I submitted our first history-based op-ed to the Baltimore Sun in 2008, and we spent at least a week agonizing over every word, sending drafts back and forth to each other. And then we sent it into the Baltimore Sun. And they responded that afternoon. Yep, we like it. We're going to run it tomorrow. Jeez! Are you sure? Off it goes, right? Almost fainted, right? Okay. Now, again, if all of this sounds like just sheer drudgery, let me assure you that being an historian does have its moments. I swear it does. It's given me the chance to travel as I do research, as I present research, to prepare courses, to plan for study tours. It's given me the chance to travel to Normandy with colleagues where we interviewed a man named Andre Heinz. Andre Heinz was a member of the French Resistance in World War II. He told us how he couldn't tell his own parents what he was doing, or even that he was in the French Resistance. If they knew, and if he got captured by the Nazis and tortured, they would be captured and tortured as well. Being an historian has given me the chance to interview American veterans who landed at Normandy as well, including one old soldier who was sailing across the channel, the English Channel, on a transport with his twin brother. When it came time to go their own ways into separate landing crafts, his twin stuck out his hand and said, "Well, good luck." The guy I was interviewing didn't shake his brother's hand, saying, "I'll shake your hand when we're both in France." You can guess what happened. His brother was killed in Omaha Beach. This is going to sound a little braggy now, so pardon me for that, but being a historian has given me the chance to meet and visit with 6 Pulitzer Prize winners, not counting Woodward and Bernstein themselves. And even the long hours in the archives have their moments. I've come across letters and telegrams from FDR, from Eleanor Roosevelt, Harry Truman, W.B. Du Bois, the poet Langston Hughes, one totally unexpected telegram from Leon Trotsky, one of the leaders of the Bolshevik, the Russian Revolution in 1917. A telegram of his just popped up in this thing. I was like, where did this come from? I'll tell you that story later too. In doing the research on the Agnew book, of course, there were letters and messages from Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger. Agnew was a big buddy with Frank Sinatra. Right? So that's pretty cool. There's also the bizarre that you come across. Especially in the Agnew book, there were lots of letters from conspiracy theorists, alleging the most bizarre conspiracies against them specifically. That's the part that always fascinates me, how all of these scary forces are aimed at them. And you know, why exactly the Illuminati, or the Trilateral Commission, or the Communists, or invariably it seems the Jews in general, why they are going after a hardware store owner in Rock Hill, South Carolina, is a good question, right? This is real tinfoil hat stuff, and it gets pretty dark. Scratch the surface of a modern-day conspiracy theory believer, and you find a bigot before long. But sometimes the bizarre is funny. In the depths of Agnew's legal troubles, and boy did he have legal troubles, before resigning from the vice presidency, he received thousands of letters of support. Thousands. If you know or remember anything from Agnew, the word disgraced probably comes to mind. Not for these people. I came upon an opened up inside of a card from an elderly couple in California. Very serious. They're writing with great sorrow and earnestness about Agnew's troubles, blaming it all on the media, and how unfair it all was, and how the commies at the Washington Post were going to get Nixon next, and how the country is probably in its final days of greatness. Really, heavy, serious stuff. Wow. I turned the card over, and on the cover of the card I found that image of the kitty clinging to a branch, and it said, "Hang in there, baby!" Another letter to Agnew, again during this very desperate time for the vice president. I mean, it was all coming apart for him. Another letter came from a writer in Australia, whose letter started something like, "I see you've been in the news lately." Yep, he sure has. And then he proceeded to write out a 5-page, single-space family history that ended with the question of whether he and Agnew were related. Just, buddy, you missed the mark here, right? Just like, this isn't the right time. One Agnew fan felt that the vice president needed to be reminded of an Ann Landers column in 1969 from a concerned dad, capital C, capital D, concerned dad. Seems the dad was worried about his college-age daughter's behavior. So, to straighten her out, he told Ann Landers he was cutting off the daughter financially. But for me, it was the title of this article that instantly livened up what had been a long day of research. The title of that column says, quote, "Cutting off the loot helps end the orgies." I was a little confused, I have to say. Did that mean like during? You know, like, come on people, let's go. Let's wrap it up. Gotta go mow the lawn. The title was in great big print too. And having it in front of me in the archives, I suddenly felt like I was busted looking at a Playboy or something. You know, talk about flashback to Greene County days, right? So I'm sitting in the archives kind of like, you know, I don't want the others to see what I have in front of me. It's a little embarrassing, actually. This is the only thing you'll remember from this talk, by the way. Coming to the Green Bean next Christmas. You walk in and get a cup. Somebody say, "Hey, hey, you're the orgy guy, aren't you?" No, 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 no. Somewhere mom and dad are looking down saying, "Really, Chuck?" You had to share that. Sorry. I asked my history colleagues at St. Mary's College to share a couple of their golden moments from the archives. My colleague Gail writes about divorce in and early 1900s England. She found a case where a wife accused her husband of cruelty because he forced her to go fishing with him. This ended up in court. My colleague Chris works on the lives of women in France in the 1700s. In her research, she needed to see this document that was signed by Marie Antoinette. The French archivist huddled, right? And they decided that she was allowed to examine the document, but Madame would not be allowed to touch it, of course. An historian friend of mine from Texas one time found herself in a conversation with Nellie Connolly about November 22nd, 1963. If that name doesn't ring a bell, Nellie Connolly was sitting in the car seat directly in front of JFK. Being an historian has given me the chance to try anyway to understand and then explain how we've gotten where we are. And this brings me to where I need to talk about why it's worth studying history today, and why I believe that reading and engaging with and facing up to our past is so important. So I have to be serious now. In the past 20 years or so, we all know that there has been so much misinformation put into our personal news ecosystems that it's given a kind of permission for some people to reject the basic facts and evidence that they don't like. And this includes basic facts of history and the evidence that is the foundation of our historical understanding. The track record, this isn't the first time that Americans have done this, but the track record for when Americans do this, the evidence reveals that these are not our best moments as Americans. On the eve of the 1860 election, the last one before the Civil War, an Atlanta newspaper is just one example of where the South was politically at this time, proclaimed that, and I'm quoting, we regard every man who does not boldly declare African slavery to be a social, moral, and political blessing as an enemy to the South. Adding heat to this unapologetic defense of slavery, the South was rife with wild conspiracies that Lincoln knew he was powerless to stop. For example, that Lincoln was actually of mixed-race heritage, which back then would have been a bad thing, was one of these conspiracies. That a Lincoln administration would send gangs of armed black men to commit sexual assault on white Southern women. This was one of these conspiracies. Lincoln noted that the white Southern position had become that they alone, he said, could construe and enforce the Constitution properly or correctly. Anyone else who disagreed with the Southern view was lying, or, as the Atlanta newspaper said, an enemy. And, Lincoln predicted, should the nation elect him, Southerners by seceding would, Lincoln said, destroy the Union and blame the great crime of its destruction on Lincoln. In other words, Lincoln already feared the conspiracy-driven, conservative pro-slavery Southerners would tear apart the Union and then blame the North for the consequences. Look at what you made us do. Similarly, the writer James Russell Lowell, in February of 1861, the war begins in April, said of the North, he said, "We lost sight of the truth, that though men may fail to convince others by a repetition of nonsense, they nevertheless persuade themselves and impregnate their own minds with a belief in fallacies that have been uncontradicted only because they are not worth contradiction." The rest of the country, Lowell adds, had been too slow, he says, in arriving at the conclusion that treasonable talk would lead to treasonable action, because they could not conceive that anybody should be so foolish. After World War II, as you all know, the Cold War began to take hold of Americans' minds. A key moment came in 1949 when China came under communist rule. The long Chinese Civil War ending in favor of Mao Zedong. How could this have happened? Well, because China is a vast, complicated country with a long and complex history, and because Mao's troops were highly motivated, relentless fighters. But for many Americans, it seemed that we had lost China to the communists. A revealing perspective there, isn't it? That China was ours to lose in the first place. The Truman administration took a beating from his Republican rivals who began to accuse the Democrats as being soft on communism. Okay, politics is a contact sport. Truman himself could throw some sharp elbows. But it was in this context that we then see the emergence of Joe McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, whose name often gets used as a shorthand reference for this entire period. What's relevant, I think, for us today is that McCarthy's fame, in particular, sprang from a bald-faced lie he told in a speech at Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950 about there being 205 known communists working in the State Department. There weren't. He knew there weren't. But he knew that people are afraid of communists. So this would get him in the headlines, and it worked. Then called to produce the evidence of these 205 known communists, it quickly became clear that McCarthy didn't have any. But even as this unfolded, McCarthy's approval rating in the public kept going up. Many Americans just sensed or felt he must be right. So it didn't matter to them whether McCarthy was always telling the truth or whether he found any actual communists or not. Now again, if you're thinking, well, that's politics, I'd say yes to a point. That mudslinging is just politics doesn't mean that it always has the same historical consequences. Because it doesn't. Sometimes it's fairly harmless. And sometimes it has huge implications historically. In this case, allegations of communist, socialist, or Marxist sympathies were aimed at progressive movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And here's where historians can go back and look at those years and see that at some level this McCarthy style of politics was not about communism at all. It became, for example, an effective way to push back against the civil rights movement. How so? What's the connection? Segregationists constantly accused Martin Luther King of being a communist. While Martin Luther King could at times be critical of how capitalism worked in America, He was also the most middle-class representative of the black community imaginable. Educated, a homeowner, coat and tie in public at all times, a man of faith, a husband with a stay-at-home wife and mother of their children. All things that in the white community would signal solid American values of the 1950s. This was the person being accused of being a communist. And for a lot of white Southerners for a long time it worked. Why? Because they'd already been conditioned to accept what was falsely being asserted. Facts be damned. So to circle back to where we started with this point, McCarthy's lies here, we need to be clear on where that kind of politics can lead. Those lies touched a chord, and they manipulated the anxieties of many Americans after World War II, that the world was changing in ways that made them feel unsettled. They then ended up fueling. These lies that communists were everywhere, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, ended up fueling the violent resistance against the civil rights movement, often in the name of the fight against communism. It's all part of the same world. The resistance to the civil rights movement is a difficult chapter in our recent history, and that's putting it mildly, and it's more recent than we may care to admit. Think of the icons of that movement. Rosa Parks. Everybody loves Rosa Parks, right? She received so many death threats that she and her husband ended up moving to Michigan. She just died in 2005. John Lewis, his skull fractured on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, died last year. And Bob Moses just died today. Maybe we should take heed of James Russell Lowis's observation that in his view, that the North in the late 1850s and 60s had waited too long. Maybe we're not too late in pointing out just how dangerous it is when some in society, indeed some people in positions of great power and influence, push the notion that certain facts don't matter or aren't real or are part of a conspiracy against you, and that certain fantasies are real. Politics is a tough line of work. Governing is hard. Governing well is really hard. It's tough enough to do when people agreeing on the facts have good faith disagreements over the way forward. But that world is in danger of slipping away. And as an historian, it is genuinely alarming to me that the most relevant political question for today is, do you accept the reality of facts or not? But again, speaking as an historian, we'd better start asking it, and we'd better start right now. Thanks.
Tremendous job, Chuck. Thank you very much. Now we're going to throw this open to questions, and I said I get the first one. And since we're at home, we're going to bring this right down to the level of the Greene County, Iowa Historical Society. Give us some tips. Give us your views. What should we do as a local history society to preserve and present our story?
Yeah, great.
And then we'll go to you, and I'll moderate.
Okay. Be nice. So, as we get to that part of the Q&A, I'll just tell you that I'm not very good at Q&A. Like a lot of, I think, Midwesterners, I come up with the answer about 6 hours later. So, give me your email address, and about Wednesday, I'll say, got it. All right. So, locally, you guys are doing a great job, right? And what I'm seeing, what I'm looking at your website and talking with Chuck and a bit with Rick as well, right? That, you know, local histories are part Chamber of Commerce, right? You want people to come and, hey, what do they have there? And check it out. And nothing wrong with that. That's good, right? And local history is also, I think, has an important role to play in what we call, you know, creating the civic community, right? The community of citizens, the community of all of us engaged in life in Jefferson, Greene County, Scranton, what have you, right? And there are lots of ways of doing it, and you guys are doing many of what I would recommend. This is what we call material culture stuff, right? Material culture. Of course, academics are going to take this and make it sound really, really complex. Material culture is just, the things from the past, right? And they're very important. They're very important, for us to see. They're especially important for young people to see because it's tactile, right? You can see it, right? And there's a connection that people can make with material culture that is different and in some ways better, right, than what I do as a historian, which is all text, pretty much, right? We read, we write. That's good. Don't stop doing that, right? But, we have a lot better understanding that people learn, some people learn better through things like, visual, right? The audio, right? And so we want we want a local historical society to have those avenues of learning as well. It would be fabulous if there was just a wonderful, 250-page history of Greene County. People like me would love that. But not everyone is going to, right? And that's okay, right? But it's awfully important to be able to introduce and expose the people of the community, especially the kids, to just where they are living, right? Geographically as well as chronologically, to here and now, right? So the collection of material culture and having special displays and exhibits, great idea, right? Great idea. I wouldn't be afraid to reach out to academics, right? Like myself. Our college is in St. Mary's County, and I hear from the St. Mary's County Historical Society once in a while, well, they will be starting a new project, like on the 50s and 60s and 70s. And they'll just say, hey, we're going to launch this project. Can you give us a few good books to make sure we're on solid ground? And most academics are like, sure, absolutely. Happy to work with local history. Oral histories. Oral histories are a great tool, a great way of preserving, right? And oral histories are a great way of getting young people involved as well, right? So, your high school history teacher, for example, this would be a great class project, right? To have, sophomores in high school, juniors in high school, identify people of certain, generational age groups and work up a list of questions, right? The teacher should help work up the list of questions. I've helped work up questions of oral histories for high school students before, right? And just contact people in the community and just very low key, doesn't have to be high pressure at all, very low key, just what's your background, where are you from, where were your parents from, what did they do? And if you run out of stuff, I tell my students, if you run out of stuff, just hold up a list. What do you remember about JFK? What do you remember about the 1969 World Series? Well, Baltimore Orioles lost and I was devastated is what I remember. Not that I hold on to grudges or anything like that. So oral histories. And by the way, we should be doing oral histories of COVID right now. Right? Right now. What do you remember about January 2020? What do you remember about February? What do you remember about March? And so forth. We should be doing this right now. Right? So, oral histories. But I really think the totality is what's important, and it's kind of history. It can be very dry, and especially for young kids. And we've got to keep finding ways of making it come to life. And my experience with my own students is when they can talk to someone, when they can see an artifact, it really comes to life. It's not just something that Holden is going on and on about Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon. Right?
Great. Next question. Nancy.
As one of the legion of history majors who actually never worked in the field, but I'm good at trivial pursuit. What I discovered in high school with one teacher and in college were the primary sources.
Yeah.
Slave narratives, even
Yeah.
Bruce Catton's Civil War.
Yeah.
How do we do that? I would have memorized the New York phone book of the history course that said to do that, but we forget to engage kids
Yeah.
on the level where they can
Yeah.
be engaged, and that means bringing people in who have resources. And
Right. So I mean, one of the benefits of age and experience is you all know who served in Vietnam, right? You have a pretty good idea who went to Vietnam or Korea and so forth. That's knowledge that locally that there's a good chance the kids, maybe even their own grandkids, don't really, they might have heard of them, but they don't really make that connection, right? You know, you mentioned the slave narratives. You know, this was a project that was started under the New Deal, right? So, yeah, this was, you know, I'm convinced that Franklin Roosevelt was terrified of roaming bands of unemployed historians. Right? And so he thought, my God, let's put them to work. And so one of the things, I mean, right? So he put them to work. They were able to identify and track down people who were old enough to have been enslaved. And they got their microphones out and they did oral histories, and they're a fantastic resource for historians, right? Those are wonderful primary sources because, you know, a lot of people coming out of enslavement would have been illiterate, so it's not like they're writing letters or keeping diaries. So that history, to the extent that history relies on the text, on what's been written, that's not there, right, in that way. So we got to find other ways to capture that history. And again, this speaks to the value of oral history.
Next, Glenn.
In lieu of reading the book, which I probably should do, what is the most shocking or interesting thing you found out about Mr. Agnew?
Good question. Everybody hear that?
Well, if you choose not to read the book,
Or buy the book.
Christmas will be here. And I would recommend, anyway. Boy, great question. So the question was, you know, just the wildest thing about Agnew. A couple of things come to mind. Some of them I couldn't quite unravel. But I was going through his letters and his papers. I mean, he's county executive, Baltimore County, governor of Maryland, vice president. So his collection is vast. It is hundreds of thousands of documents. I didn't go through all of them. Went through a lot of them, but I was going through one folder, and the way it works, let me use that question to ask, well, what do you actually do when you go into an archive? So Spiro Agnew's papers are at the Hornbeck Library in the University of Maryland in College Park. College Park is a suburb of DC. So you go in and you fill out, I'd like to research Spiro Agnew. Okay. And there's what they call a finder's guide. You can see box 1 has this, box 2 has that, box 3 has, you know, and folder 1 in box 1 has this, and so on. So you say, okay, I want to look at box 4 of this collection. Okay, so fill it out, give them your ID, yeah, okay, off they go. And you sit in a reading room full of tables. And back before you could bring your laptop in, just a pencil. That's all you got, was just a pencil, because they don't want ink on the documents, right? And of course, you put a bunch of historians in there and someone's going to, you know, knock the soda over or something, right? So they bring it out and they give you the box, and you take the box back to your table, and you take the lid off the box, and you can only take one folder out at a time, right? And they will, you know, you have 2 folders out. They do. So 1 folder at a time. So I'm going through this one folder, and it's basic kind of office memo stuff. Nothing terribly exciting. It's travel plans, you're scheduled to go to Tulsa to get to speak, blah, blah, blah. And there was just one, just almost blank sheet of paper that said, we have received a call from, and it was a woman's name. And it was a phone number. And it says, I assume you want me to take care of this. Now, Agnew had a bit of a reputation. And there were a couple of other hints like that suggested that there might have been somebody trying to blackmail him about straying away from his marriage vows. So there was that. No, the weirder stuff was Agnew, a little bit during his vice presidency, but then afterwards, he turned a bit anti-Semitic, and some of that stuff got pretty weird, pretty strange. My favorite Agnew story, though, it's not bizarre, it's just, what was he thinking? When Richard Cohen came down to talk to Zach and me, and again, Richard Cohen wrote for the Washington Post, and the Watergate scandal was happening at the exact same time that Agnew's scandal happened, 73. And so Cohen was covering Agnew the way Woodward and Bernstein were covering Nixon. Right, so Cohen comes down with Bradley, and they're talking to Zach and me. And they haven't talked about this in years. And as Cohen is kind of reliving this, he's pulling his hair and he says, God, it was all so cheap, too. And Zach went, well, what do you mean? He said, he was just taking a few $100. And so Agnew was on the take. Way back as Baltimore County executive, Baltimore County is a suburban county, post-World War II, lots of growth, lots of roads being run, lots of bridges being built, lots of culverts, right? Lots of concrete contracts. He was getting the taste, right? He was getting his beak wet, as they say. He was getting a little cut of all of these local contracts. He continued this as governor of Maryland, and then he continued it as vice president. So Cohen says, I'd be talking to these local contractors from Towson, and Towson is a suburb of Baltimore. And they're just a guy with a cement company. And they'd say, they put in this application to get this contract to pave this street. And the guy in the government would say, well, you got to drive down to D.C. and see the vice president. Like, what? Yeah. And it's going to cost you about $800. So these guys these are just guys. They're getting on the BW Parkway that connects Baltimore and Washington. They're driving down. They're shown into the old executive building where the vice president's office is. And they're, okay, the vice president will see you now. So they go in and, my God, there's Spiro Agnew, the vice president of the United States. And they come in and they sit down, and he's sitting behind his desk. Well, it's nice to see you, And there goes the envelope of cash across the desk. Agnew pulls the drawer open. Thank you very much. Off he goes. And Cohen was just like, this guy was about to be president of the United States. And he couldn't shut off the graft, right, for long enough.
I think I have to follow up to Lynn's question. Recall his nattering nabobs of negativism. I can't even say it 50 years later.
So at the time, Agnew's reputation was that his job, if you remember back in 1968, or if you've read about that election, Nixon is running against Hubert Humphrey on the Democratic side. But there was a third candidate in the race. Anyone remember who that was? You didn't think you'd be tested, did you? No, that's all right, that's not fair. George Wallace. George Wallace is running on the American Independent Party, which consisted of George Wallace. So if you remember Wallace, he's the old Alabama governor. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow. That's not bad, actually. Segregation forever. He's campaigning in 68, and he is, as we would say, he's throwing red meat out there. And he's got Nixon really worried. We forget that Wallace's poll numbers in early 68 were getting up around 29%. That's pretty good. And so one of the reasons that Nixon chose Agnew was to go out there and get that George Wallace voter. And to do this then, and this gets to Chuck's question, he needed speeches. He needed the kind of George Wallace speech that would appeal to those voters, right, who might be drawn toward George Wallace and not vote for Nixon. And so he did. And so he had a host of very talented speechwriters, guys like William Safire, Pat Buchanan, still alive, right? But Nixon himself wrote a lot of these speeches. And Agnew, one of the things that we found was that the thinking about Agnew was that he was just this puppet. He was just kind of rolled out to say these things. But what Zach found, and Zach researched this actually, one of my co-authors, he found that the rough drafts of those speeches. And on the rough drafts of the speeches, you can see that Agnew is editing them. Right? The marginalia, as we call it, the stuff in the margins. Right? Agnew is making his own additions, which we thought, hey, that's pretty cool. Look at old Agnew there. I mean, it's not cool. Don't cheat, right? But still. So So Buchanan and Sapphire and Agnew love putting these alliterations together. All right, the nattering nabobs of negativism, right? Just that these mean basically the liberals, right? That they're all just a bunch of negative, people. They don't have anything good to say. All they do is complain about America and so forth. And they loved those. They knew that it made the Democrats furious, right? And so they kind of got into this. And so then it almost became, what kind of catchy phrase can we put together to tick them off this time? Right? And they really had great fun with that. And it was very effective.
Jen?
This is a change from Agnew, but I like history like you do. And it's maybe a loaded question, and it's an oxymoron. What do you think of historical fiction?
Oh, no, that's a great question. Yeah. I'm a fan. I go for it, absolutely. Here's the thing, the historical fiction is the question. Good historical fiction is great, right? I like it when it is, somewhat tied to the actual history. But if it's understood that it's fiction, I'm okay with taking a little license. That's fair, it's fiction, right? As long as it's very clear that this is what you're reading. I think it can actually be effective, especially for younger people, in helping to capture the mood, the sound, the flavor, the heat, I love my colleagues in the historical profession, but we are not the most exciting writers you'll ever come across in the world, right? This is something that we're working on, right? But historical fiction can really kind of bring this stuff to life. When I was talking about being in St. Paul and getting interested in history, actually a couple of the books I read were by Gore Vidal, of all people, right? And his book on Lincoln, I thought was amazing. I knew it was fiction. But I was like, wow, this is really cool. This is good stuff. It can help bring things to life. Again, as long as we're keeping in mind that it's fiction, right? So
isn't there a danger of misleading people?
It is. That's why I say, as long as we understand it's fiction, have at it. Enjoy yourself. Yeah.
Anybody? Yeah, Rick?
Chuck, is there any difference that you've noticed from when you started teaching until today in the preparation of students or
Yeah.
Rick Moraine asked if there's any difference in students today in their preparation for history, right, than when he started his career.
Yes. What has intervened is the teaching to the test kind of approach. And we have students coming into our history classes with not as good a grasp of the basics as they did in the 90s and early 2000s. And there's nothing wrong with the students. They're perfectly fine. They're sharp as ever. They're sharp as ever, folks. Good news, these kids are smart. They really are, right? And so I've had to adjust a bit on what I assume they know. I've had to adjust. And again, for college students, you can get them up to speed pretty quickly. That's the good news, right? But that starting point, like the intro level classes, I can't assume if I just make a reference to Joe McCarthy, for example, that they might not know who that was. Yeah.
Got another one right back here.
How does the historian act or resolve or attack these laws that prohibit you from teaching certain things that you probably think are historically true?
Yeah.
Important question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you get that, everybody? Okay.
You mean today, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, okay. There is some concern about, especially teaching the history of race relations, and this thing called critical race theory, right? And there are some politicians are trying to get it outlawed so that it can't be taught in schools, et cetera, et cetera. This is, first off, it's very, very clear that they don't actually know what it is. And it seems much less about what's what's being taught in history than taking a shot across the bow at their political opponents. Oftentimes they include public educators as being their opponents. Critical race theory, you might have seen or heard of this. I'll try and make this really, it's a legal theory. It's a way of studying the implications of laws over time. And it came out of the 1980s. It's used primarily by legal scholars, right? And what it does is it studies the assumptions that go into the writing of a law or the writing of a policy. And then it asks us to kind of follow the trail of where that law or that policy leads. And the race part of it. So let me give you an example. Let me try and give you an example of just what somebody who studies critical race theory would actually be looking at. Let's say that you want to study wealth and education disparities in black and white men in Philadelphia in the 1980s. Okay, that's right. And you follow the story of a black man who was born in Tennessee in 1920. The state law would have segregated those schools, right? The state law of Tennessee would have segregated those schools. So he goes to an all-black school, underfunded, under-resourced, and the assumption would be not as good, okay? So he graduates from his segregated high school, and because state law doesn't let him go to the University of Tennessee, it's segregated as well, he goes to Fisk University, an all-black school in Nashville. And let's say he finishes top of his class, right? And so he moves to Philadelphia, and he wants to go to Penn, University of Pennsylvania Law School, Ivy League, great reputation. So he applies, and the people on the admissions board, right, look at his background, and they assume what? They assume that he isn't as well educated as some of the other applicants, right? And so, because he comes from a poor school in Tennessee or an all-black college in Tennessee, right? So he gets denied, right? Now, they may feel like, as individuals on that college admission board, that law school admission boards, they feel like, well, we are very enlightened people, but we have, you know, as an individual, I'm not racist, but we have a duty to the school. We've got to get the best applicants and so forth, okay? So he doesn't get in, right? So he spends his life very honorably as a bus driver for the city bus system and so forth, right? But he doesn't accumulate the wealth that those law students at Penn, right? He doesn't build up the local prestige that the law students, those lawyers from Penn. He doesn't gather the local reputation that lands him in the city council and runs for mayor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So what do we have at the end? We have this disparity. Right? And that's what critical race theory does. It studies, how did we get here? What were those assumptions that were baked into the laws, in this case, the Tennessee laws, right? The Tennessee laws, what were those assumptions that were baked in those laws in the first place, and how did they manifest themselves over time? That's what critical race theory does. That's it. That's all it does. It's a very useful way of studying racial history. Right? And it offers a critique of, you know, societal systemic racism that's different from just the usual way of thinking about racism as just what individuals do, and you just should try not to. Right? So that's it. And so this campaign against it is to legal scholars, it's like, what are you talking about here? It just makes no sense, and that's where you arrive at the conclusion that it's not really being done in good faith, frankly.
Chuck, I think we'll call it.
All right.